Hey there, this is Justin Schauers, the principal broker here at Home Basics Real Estate. Today we're going to be talking about the real estate purchase contract, otherwise known as the REPC. You should have a copy of this pulled up either on your screen or in your hand. It would have come with the email that we use to send this link to you. The first thing that we deal with, of course, is the offer reference date, the date that you make the offer. We have the buyer's name, we have the seller's name, and then we have a discussion about earnest money. There are two options to deliver earnest money. One is to write a check on the spot and present that with the offer, or the one that we most commonly use and prefer is that you would agree to deliver the earnest money no later than 4 calendar days after going under contract. So we'll negotiate back and forth, finally come to terms, everyone signs it, and then you have 4 calendar days to get us that money. It's typically through a personal check, and then we would sign and receipt for it. The earnest money is refundable as long as you work within the deadlines that are set forth in Section 24 of this contract. We'll be talking a lot about that today. It is also part of your down payment. So if your total down payment were $20,000 and with the offer you agreed to post $1,000 earnest money, then you would bring in the additional $19,000 to closing when we actually settle on this deal. Okay, Section 1, we talk about the property address and the tax ID number. Section 1.1 makes it very clear that certain things inside the home are intended to be included, a built-in dishwasher, light fixtures, things like that. But Section 1.2 and 1.3 are important, that we are asking the seller, for example, for the refrigerator or maybe a washer dryer. If we want to include it, it's got to be in this contract. If we want it excluded, it'd be 1.3, might be an old rickety playground set or an old hot tub or something like that we want to have excluded. Section 1.4 talks about water rights. Typically in residential real estate, we're not transferring any water rights, but if we do have a property that does have some, then we need to make sure that those are transferred to you. Section 2, purchase price. This is where we state what we are offering. Let's today, for today's example, put $200,000. We put $200,000 on that line. And then Section 2A would talk again about the earnest money. We would say, for example, $1,000 would go on that line. You take a new loan out. Let's pretend you have a 5% down payment, so the total down payment on $200,000 is $10,000. Your new loan would then be $190, and then Section 2D would read $9,000. So $1,000 earnest money, $190 on a new loan, and then $9,000 in additional funds. That completes the entire transaction. That all adds back up to $200,000. And you should note that any amount shown can be adjusted as deemed necessary by buyer and the lender. We're just sort of stating or spelling it out to the seller how you intend to finance this property. Section 3.1 is this, talks about settlement. Settlement is when you go sign documents. It takes about 45 minutes at a title company. And there's some prorations that are made there. Section 3.2, the real estate prorations, taxes, the homeowner association dues, things like that. Remember, in a condo, there also can be some other fees. There can be a transfer fee, there can be a community enhancement fee, reinvestment fee. Sometimes there are some other charges associated with buying into a homeowner association. If there are any special assessments that either a municipality is going to levy or charge, or a homeowner association is going to charge, we're asking the seller to bring those current before closing. Section 3.4 talks about the closing, the costs associated with closing the deal at the title company, that each party would pay their own fees. Now, if we're asking the seller to contribute towards your closing costs, the closing costs would also include these title fees. Section 3.5, closing. That means you have settled, signed all the documents, that the funds have arrived from the lender, and that the title company has gone down to the county and recorded the deal into your name. That's when you own the property, and so possession is upon closing. That process takes about 24 hours. So don't get up from the closing table, settlement table, and then ask for keys. It's going to take about 24 hours. 5, confirmation of agency disclosure. This is who's representing who. You would have the seller's agent, their brokerage, our name, our brokerage. Section 6, title to the property. It says that here in Utah, the seller will pay for a policy of title insurance that will protect you after closing in case anything happens, pops up. They will take care of it for you. Section 7, seller's disclosures. Think of this as a packet of information that the seller will prepare for you that will help you evaluate the property. The first thing in the seller's disclosures is a seller property condition disclosure. That's a 7-page document that asks the seller all about their ownership. Have you ever had any leaks in your roof? Have you had any problems with your foundation? What about your appliances? It's really quite comprehensive, and you might find some real value in that if the seller fills it out properly. You'll also get a commitment for the title insurance. You'll get a copy of the code's covenants and restrictions, like it says in 7C. You will get, if you're buying into a homeowner association, we'll get you the most recent minutes from the most recent meetings. We'll get you financial statements, budgets, reserves. You want to make sure that you are buying into a very healthy community. If it were rented, we get a copy of the lease. And typically there are no water rights, but if there were, they would tell us what they have. We would define those. And if the seller had any known environmental problems for building or zoning code violations, they would give that to us in writing. We take all that information, and then we have our contingencies that are already built here into the contract. The first one is your due diligence condition. The whole deal is conditioned upon you feeling really great about the property. You're going to use a professional home inspector most likely to get a very good handle on the physical condition, but you can check out schools, communities, you can check out agricultural activities, road infrastructure projects that may affect the value of the property. Typically you're given about 2 weeks to do that. Assuming everything looks good, we'll go on to section 8.2, which is the appraisal condition. The property has to appraise for at least the purchase price. And just maybe to give you this expectation, we are having some appraisals come in low. It just depends on the market conditions. We can typically negotiate through those. But if you don't like the way the appraisal came back, you can certainly get out and get your earnest money back. Okay, as long as you do so within the deadline. We're talking about those deadlines. Section 8.3, financing condition. You should have a very good pre-qualification, and you should be working with a very talented loan officer to make sure that we don't have any problems there. But once in a while, during that under contract period, as you're putting your loan together and providing the supporting documents, sometimes we have a problem. And if we can't solve that problem, then we need to get you out of this contract, and as long as we do so before the deadline, you get your earnest money back. Okay? So it's very important to work with a good loan officer, possibly and hopefully somebody that we know and recommend and really trust. Section 8.4 allows you to pay for an extension if we need an extension on any of our deadlines. Typically we don't offer to pay for an extension though. Section 9 addenda, there are almost always at least one addendum, and that is where we would address the seller paying closing costs. We'll get to that in just a minute. There could be an FHA or VA loan addendum or something else. Section 10, home warranty plan. This says that there will be a home warranty issued, that the buyer would order it, the buyer would select the company, the cost would not exceed $375, but the seller would pay for it at closing. The home warranty is good for a full year after you purchase the property, and if something goes wrong, furnace, water heater, garbage disposal, you make a claim. There's typically a service or a service deductible or copay about $60. But they're very well worth having. Section 10.2 says that this property is sold in as-is condition. That means that when you sign the dotted line at the end of the day, that's evidence to everybody in the transaction that you had a chance to evaluate the property, you know about the property, everything looks great. Section 10.3 warns the seller, though, that they had better disclose anything that would adversely affect the value of the property and do a very good job, a very thorough and complete job. Section 11 talks about walkthrough inspections. We can go through anytime you want during the under contract period, but typically we'll go back to the home right before closing to make sure it's as it was the last time you saw it, or if we've required the seller to do any work, that it has been done. Section 12 changes during the transaction. Just so you know, they can't lease the property, further financial encumber the property, remove a wall, paint something. It's sort of frozen in this under contract period. 13, authority of signers. We typically have a private seller and a private buyer, but sometimes we're buying a home from a bank or an estate or an LLC, and we just need to make sure that we have the proper documentation, proper signatures get on there. Okay, 14, complete contract. That just means that everything needs to be in writing and signed by all parties. If we want to change something, we certainly can do that. It just has to be done on the proper documentation. Everybody has to sign it. Section 15, if there's a problem that arises between you and the seller during all of this, if we check may, it says we may be able to resolve that problem around a conference table. If that doesn't work, we would go to a mediation provider. And I, as a broker, like to check may. It gives us one additional step. In many years of real estate, though, this only has come into play a couple of times. It's really not a big issue. Section 16, if the buyer defaults, meaning you don't close on this, all of your deadlines have expired, and you say, I'm just not going to close on this home, there's a chance you're going to lose your earnest money. And so just be aware of that. Your earnest money is completely protected, but once all those deadlines expire, that we'll talk about in section 24, then your earnest money could be at stake. If the seller decides not to sell, which is very rare, they would give you your earnest money back plus an amount equal to it. So if you posted $1,500, they'll give you an additional $1,500 on top of that, which would go towards paying for the cost of a home inspection or the cost of the appraisal that you may have had. Section 17, if attorneys got involved, which they usually don't, the losing party pay attorney's fees. 18, notices need to be in writing and signed by all parties. 19, no assignment. You can't tie this up in your name and then assign it to another buyer to close on. Section 20 talks about insurance. You're going to have insurance lined up from the day that you close. You call your insurance broker and say, I'm buying a home, and what are your rates? And then when you select that insurance broker, you give them the name and number of the loan officer that you're using, and they know exactly how to communicate and get the proper documentation. Section 20.2, if something happens during the intercontract period to the property, the seller would bear that responsibility. 21, time is of the essence. If we present an offer to a seller, we would typically have a deadline for them to respond, maybe 8 p.m. tomorrow evening, something like that. We need to make sure that we are aware of the deadlines on any of these contracts and do our very best to meet them. Section 22, we do a lot of scanning and emailing. Those are still considered the originals. Frankly, nowadays we do a lot of digital signatures, which helps us a lot. Section 23, acceptance occurs when the seller takes a look at the offer, they sign it, and then they communicate back to us. That communication is the true acceptance. Section 24, I've been teasing this. These are important deadlines. 24A is the deadline for the seller to prepare all that documentation and hand it over to you. They typically have about 7 days to do that. 24B, due diligence deadline. That's for you to hire your home inspection and get all those things done so that you're comfortable with the property. Typically, you'll get about 14 days. Section 24C, financing appraisal deadline. You have to have your appraisal back and your financing well in hand, and then we'll proceed. Okay? After that deadline is expired, your earnest money typically will go hard. 24D, settlement deadline. That's when we want to go ahead and sign all the paperwork, both sides would. And if the property is vacant, we can typically close ahead of that deadline that's mentioned there in 24D. If it is not vacant, you can't call the seller and say, our loan is done, we're 2 weeks early, and would you get out? So you can't do that. We just need to be aware of those deadlines. Section 25, again, this is where we would give a response deadline by the seller. The seller would receive this offer. They could either accept it, which would be awesome. They'll probably tweak it, though, through a counter offer. We'll go back and forth. Or they could reject it. If you're just too low and not in the ballpark, they could reject it. Okay. You should also have an addendum number 1. And the most common thing that we address in an addendum is asking the seller to contribute towards your closing costs. So it might say, seller to contribute $6,000 towards the buyer's closing costs. So again, if you offer $200,000, but you're asking the seller to pay $6,000 towards your closing costs, the offer is $194,000, right? Typically, we can structure a deal where you won't have to come out of pocket for your closing costs. If the sellers don't want to pay all of them, we might be able to put the sales price to $203,000 and then have them pay $6,000 in closing costs, which is a net of $197,000. In some cases, we won't have them pay any of the closing costs, but we'll have the lender give you a slightly higher interest rate in exchange for him paying all of your closing costs. So there are a lot of different things that we can do to avoid having to come up and out of pocket with those closing costs. And the addendum can be used to address a number of things, not just closing costs. If we needed a repair done, if we wanted to extend possession, if we want to do a leaseback scenario where the seller leases the property after you close for a certain amount of time, whatever we need to do, an addendum is the thing to use. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to call us. Thank you very much.